Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together for you each week across the Commonwealth of Virginia here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. You can find out more about us online at tertiumquids.org, archived footage of previous programs, as well as information about our Tuesday morning group coalition meetings and so much more, how you can get involved in all the processes going on in Virginia. Great program this week. Medicaid expansion with Senator Dick Black coming up a little bit later on this program. Also, we're going to visit with Erica York from the Center for Federal Tax Policy at the Tax Foundation, but we have a special treat to kick off the program here, and something perspective-wise I have found is always priceless as we debate and discuss some of the things going on in our community. It's sometimes difficult to separate ourselves from where we've grown up and 20, 30, 40, 50 years in the United States is the perspective of what the United States looks like or means, and what the liberties we were guaranteed by our founding fathers means to somebody who didn't grow up here. Carmen Alexe is the author of a great article that you can find online at the Foundation for Economic Independence as well, fee.org, Foundation for Economic Education.org, and you can find her column, I Grew Up in a Communist System, and Here's What Americans Don't Understand About Freedom. Carmen, welcome to Freedom and Prosperity Radio this week. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you, Joe?
So talk to us a little bit, first and foremost, about where you grew up, and then we're going to take your column and share it with in as much as we can with the listener, and encourage everyone to go to fee.org to download the article, share it with their friends as well. But first, where did you grow up? Share that with our audience, and then we'll begin the breakdown of where we are and how that is important and what we should be remembering.
Okay, that sounds great. I grew up in Romania, which was communist at the time, and I grew up basically during the Cold War. And I immigrated to the United States back in the early 80s, but I did have enough opportunity to experience the consequences of communism/socialism, and how basically interfered with our liberties, with the economics part of it, with shortages that we experienced during that time, and so on.
And when you first found out, and it's always illuminative, I think, for us to find out how the message of Western liberty gets into and behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War. So, Carmen, how is it you came to be in the United States, and when did you and your family first become aware that there was perhaps a better way forward than you were living in Romania?
Well, Joe, when I lived in Romania, when I was young, I was a swimmer. I was a competitive swimmer, and I had traveled extensively, both in countries in the Eastern Europe, from the Eastern Europe bloc, but also I traveled to the West and have been to West Germany and Italy and Spain and other Western European countries, and I developed relationships with swimmer friends over there. And not only that, but due to the fact that I had the opportunity to travel, I was pretty much impressed by the abundance that I had experienced, that I had seen in those countries, as far as not just, the freedom of speech, but also abundance in form of commodities and standard of living, compared to where I grew up in Eastern Europe. That's the number one reason. The other thing, too, is I grew up in in the western part of Romania, which was actually the city of Timișoara, where the revolution back in 1989 had started. And because we were so close to the western part of Romania, there was like an underground movement, and like a lot of young people, we were able to, talk amongst ourselves about the freedom and liberties that the West had. So basically it was a movement, a liberty movement, underground liberty movement, and that's pretty much what we were talking about most of the times, how we can actually either escape the system or we can do something about changing it.
Carmen, what did perhaps some of the adults or leaders in your community, did you talk to them about it, or was it strictly you kept quietly talking about amongst those who were part of this underground movement in Romania?
That was strictly part of just, kept within our underground movement. But also just have to tell you, Joe, that, say, for example, it was pretty much known that even, my parents, for example, I heard them listen to Radio Free Europe and the Voice of America. And, of course, these two channels were pretty much forbidden. You are not allowed to listen to those. When I would ask, I remember I was pretty young, and I would ask my parents, why were they listening to those channels? And my mom was telling me that that's because they're telling the truth, and that's why we have shortages here, and we don't have any liberties, and we cannot speak freely. And we just love listening to those channels.
Well, Carmen, and that's where I want to go in now, is your message to the, especially young people of this country who don't know anything else, but there are inequities right now in our system that I think are driven by almost a hybrid between what is the free market capitalism and what we've developed, which is somewhat of a hand-in-glove cronyism. And then the young people are seeing that those inequities driven not by a free market, but by a managed market dictated to by the government. And explain to them a little bit of some of the things that you before they start thinking socialism is a good idea, some of the challenges you faced growing up in Romania.
Well, first of all, Joe, socialism and communism are systems that are not sustainable in the long run. I think that what I might recommend to everyone to at least get some basic economics for them to understand, because it seems to me that the political message today, the political agenda, trying to reach, a massive audience is pretty much perceived through a compassionist view. Instead of that, I would probably recommend a little bit of basic economics because, for example, from my experience, I have been able to understand the differences between free market capitalism, cronyism, fascism, and communism and socialist systems by learning and educating myself with basic economics.
Carmen Alexe is the author of a wonderful piece at the Foundation for Economic Education, fee.org. And it's called I Grew Up in a Communist System. Here's what Americans don't understand about freedom. Many of the young people who purport collectivism and socialism are basing it on this idea of a living wage. That poverty in this country is out of control and there's inequities in our wages. Did those things exist in Romania? It sounds like there was poverty for everybody, not just for some. Or were there people who had access to more than others?
In that system, and that's what I want to clarify first, and actually I was thinking about writing another article about this, because I haven't seen a whole lot mention about the idea of communism as a totalitarian system per se. A lot of people here, I've noticed, that are actually enticed by the idea of collectivism, truly believe that if we had, empowered the government, if the government was to control all the means of production and distribution, and those people that are empowered to make those decisions would be just and fair and will do the right thing. Mm. And therefore, as a result of their honesty and sincerity and compassion, they would distribute properly and equally to everybody in the nation the wealth that is being produced. Well, we have a problem with that because humans are flawed and humans will never be perfect. And as a result of that, that was the idea when Marx and Lenin, even though with Lenin later on, we could actually see how he turned from the good guy into the bad guy. Mm-hmm. But in a system like that, you really don't have, fairness and equality. What you basically provide, you provide a system in which you have a small group, which is in the top, the elite, those mm-hmm. people in the government, the bureaucrats and the politicians, and then you have the rest, the have-nots. So you have the elites, the haves, and then you have the rest mm-hmm. of the people, the majority of the people who are the have-nots. Now, you do have a layer in between those, which is usually the intellectuals, and that's how it happened in communism after the Bolshevik Revolution. The small elite in the top, they have used a group of intellectuals, the philosophers and the educators, to spread the message of collectivism and egalitarianism and communism. So because they were intellectuals, so-called in quotation marks, obviously they were able, that was their mm-hmm. job, to spread the message of fairness and equity and equality. And this is what you have. And those people, the intellectuals, tended to have a little bit more than the have-nots.
Right.
And they were, happy enough to stay in their positions because their position were, they still had more than the rest of the majority.
Exactly. They were allowed to a little bit of the insiders club otherwise.
Exactly.
So, Carmen, when you speak to young people here in the United States, what pushback do you commonly get from them? Because much of the argument I hear, and we're in a college town as a basis, it revolves around mistakes that the United States made 200 years ago and has been working on ameliorating through our system since then, but don't seem to be in existence today. What is the common pushback you get from the young people in the United States regarding your background? Do they believe you? Do they say, "Oh, you're making it up"? I hope they believe you as your testimony. But what's the common pushback?
Well, I tell you this, Joe. They're not telling me, "Hey, I don't believe you. I don't believe that you're telling me the truth." I've never had anybody tell me this. And believe me, a lot of people that I'm around in my community here, they're very much geared towards the same system that we discussed, that, the socialist and communist system. But for them, it's very, very hard to perceive, to understand what I'm talking about, because they have never lived a moment of their lives with shortages. They've always had abundance. They've always had the freedom. They could do whatever they want, whether they use that, freedom in positive ways or in, less than positive ways. So for them, it's very, very hard to understand where I'm coming from because they have never lived it. And they're not, what I've noticed, the curiosity lacks, the curiosity about understanding how this country could potentially turn into something, similar to that and a totalitarian system. I grew up in a totalitarian system, and, they cannot perceive that. They don't understand it. I think it takes a curious mind to actually delve into it and dig into it and say, okay, I want to know more. how does this work? And that, like I said before, Joe, if anybody was interested further to understand how the system works, I think it would be great for them to at least be introduced to basic economics.
Mm-hmm.
As I was reading not long ago in Basic Economics, the book, Thomas Sowell book.
Oh, wonderful book.
I'm sorry?
Wonderful book.
Wonderful book, yes. And he was stating that politics is driven, the message of politics is driven by compassion, a message of equality and fairness and justice towards human beings, other human beings. However, economics does not have any sentiments, does not have any emotions. Economics is just a science.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the problem that people don't understand. They really think that, a lot of people think that our politicians, number one, know what they're doing, and number two, a lot of people do believe that it is in man has control over everything, and therefore we should be able to, with our policies, we should be able to control economic factors, which in fact, by trying to interfere with the economy, most of the politicians and most of the policies that have been implemented have been actually very detrimental to our well-being, to the economy, and to the boom and bust cycle that obviously it's not talked about enough, in schools and everywhere in the education system.
And certainly self-interest drives a lot of economic opportunity, and we see when self-interest is removed from the equation, what's left is trips to prison, as Stalin had to do as the middle of the 20th century started to wander into the Iron Curtain countries. I think there's also a feeling that, we could dabble in this, and if it doesn't work, we'll just go back to something else. Talk about the difficulty. And again, I suggest everyone read her wonderful column at fee.org about this. But I want a sense for the listener how difficult it is to overthrow a totalitarian socialist regime, and how much tumult and how much chaos it created as the Cold War started to end and all these Iron Curtain countries started to find freedom. I think everyone was celebrating it, but there was chaos and there was danger and there was, in some cases, bloodshed across a lot of the Iron Curtain countries as that power vacuum fell from a totalitarian government. It's not easy.
No, absolutely not. I mean, obviously, in Romania, there was a revolution back in 1989 to overthrow the government. This revolution, however, and a lot of people do not know, this revolution had not started from the Romanian people just because they were tired. I mean, people were talk about it, amongst themselves. Their sentiment was very negative towards the government, towards the president, towards the system, generally speaking, but it was helped with, I should say, it was started and instigated with help from the West. I want to talk a little bit just briefly about being armed and having the opportunity to bear the arms, to have guns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You see, in Romania, we did not have guns, and that was one of the reasons for which, back when I grew up, there was absolutely not even a thought that, the people of Romania could overthrow the government, because the government had the guns and we didn't. The masses didn't have the guns. So that's one of the important issues here when young people go and basically complain about guns being so negative and so detrimental and killing people and so on and so forth. They fail to recognize that it's very important for a population to be armed.
Yeah.
Because that would be probably harder for the government to basically instill, a totalitarian system when people are armed.
And I think you bring up a great point that, again, I don't think our population quite grasps, because at this point it hasn't acted directly against us in any way, shape, or form. But our system is built around the idea of controlling the government by the fact that the citizens are able to defend themselves without them. Carmen Alexe, I really appreciate if you're around Virginia. We'd love to have you come visit us and hold an event, maybe do some speaking. Where can people find out more about you?
Well, they can find out more about me. I have started a blog last year, a website, and I want to spread my message of freedom. I try to live as free as possible. I try to make people aware of what it's like to live in communism, and how we can actually enjoy more freedom in our lives and not really be, dependent on the government. And my website is Solitary Gal, G-A-L, so it's solitarygalgal.com. That's where they could reach me, and I love to do a weekly column and post, and then I'll continue, of course, to write and for fee and submit more articles. That's where they can reach me.
Well, thank you so much for your time and your visit. We've only just scratched the surface, and we could go on for hours.
Yes.
and it is such an important message. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful weekend, and thank you for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Thank you, Joe. Have a great day.
Welcome to this week's edition of Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine created and put forth by the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Find out more about us online at tertiumquids.org. That's TERTIUMQUIDS. I was asked the other day, how do you spell tertium quids? And you can find podcasts of previous radio shows. And if you just Google search the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, you'll find us there as well. And follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Our first guest this week is Erica York, analyst for the Tax Foundation Center for Federal Tax Policy. Erica, welcome to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks, Joe.
Now, we asked Erica to come on, and she wrote a wonderful thing about the 2002 steel tariffs that President Bush put in. The article is Lessons from the 2002 Bush Steel Tariffs. And certainly everyone has got tariff on the mind, and free markets, open markets. It's been actually a fairly hotly debated subject regarding the tariffs President Trump has suggested. So what are the lessons you want us to learn from 2002?
Sure. Well, first I'd like to back up and just talk in general about what tariffs are. Even though sometimes we'll call them tariffs on China or tariffs on foreign steel in this case, it's important to remember that tariffs are actually a tax on Americans who import those goods. And that tax can create a distortion that damages economic growth, because these companies who import and pay the tax can either pass that on to consumers, which leaves less money in our budget to spend on other things, or they have to absorb those costs into their bottom line, which reduces profits and can hurt investment and jobs and economic growth. And that's really where this study from 2002 starts looking at.
Mm-hmm.
So in 2002, as you said, the George W. Bush administration placed tariffs on certain steel imports, and these were tariffs of 8% up to 30%. And the study actually estimates the unintended consequences of higher steel prices on industries that consume steel. So, for example, you can think manufacturers of machines and equipment. And the research shows that the higher steel prices led to a loss of nearly 200,000 jobs in those steel-consuming sectors. In the state of Virginia, they estimated that more than 5,000 jobs were lost. So in total, this job loss was larger than the total employment in the steel-producing sector at that time. So more Americans lost their jobs due to higher steel prices than were employed in the steel industry itself.
Well, and certainly, the argument that's made for tariffs is that when you compete against companies that are either owned wholly or partially by foreign governments and or supported by them and have cheaper labor, rather than looking at the American industries and say, well, produce your steel at the same level, would that be a better route, that the American government would then go into the American steel industry per se? Let's take that one and give them the support that helps them compete with a government-owned or partially government-owned steel manufacturer?
When we look at protection and protectionist policies, we've seen that decades of them haven't resulted in the outcomes that are intended. The results are always the same, that those come at drastic costs for American consumers with little, if any, benefit for the protected industry itself. Right now, we already have 169 different duties and tariffs and protections imposed on steel, and that provides even more evidence that these sort of policies don't work, and that they haven't worked, and going forward, they're likely to continue to create these greater costs for others in the economy than the actual protection they provide for that specific industry.
Oh, no, I understand. And my point being is that, if Chinese steel is coming in and it costs less per ton than American steel, instead of working with the American companies to become competitive with that, tariffs seem to be, from where I sit, the easier answer than that. Is that a fair thing to say about why we're at this point talking about, instead of lowering American steel costs, we're talking about raising Chinese steel costs?
I think that's probably outside our area of expertise. We're not trade policy experts. What we want to highlight is the effect of the taxes that are on American consumers, and that those don't achieve the policy goals.
Oh, no, and tax usually is the easy way out for a government to do this. You mentioned aluminum, and that's also included in this. Talk about the impact on how many things we've often talked about petroleum products, and how many things, because of plastics and things like that you may not realize come through an oil-producing nation. But talk about the impact of a tariff on aluminum, and how many things we consumers in the United States would see a price increase if that tax was levied on aluminum coming into this country.
We've estimated that a 10% tariff on aluminum imports would raise the cost of imported aluminum by nearly $1.7 billion if imports in 2018 are the same as 2017 levels. So tracing this to the final impact on consumers can be a little bit tricky, but if it is likely that Americans will be touched, most Americans will be touched in some way by those higher costs. And that higher cost would represent effectively the amount of income redistributed from American consumers to those domestic companies. We can think of things like pop cans, beer cans, aluminum foil, all of those everyday household products that contain aluminum could potentially be touched by those tariffs.
And automobiles alone, with the amount of aluminum and steel in it, would be hit particularly hard, wouldn't they?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right.
So who are the key players in this? If you have folks, because we like to direct our listeners to action, to call their senators. Certainly these sorts of things would have to go through a Senate confirmation. So Mark Warner, Tim Kaine running for re-election, are these folks that our listeners should be reaching out to try to stand in the way of these tariffs?
Sure, it's always good to be engaged and to express concern with these policies that are not free market policies. In the case of some of these tariffs, the administration is relying on certain rules that actually give them authority to place the tariffs. So in that case, it can be a little bit more difficult to get congressional oversight. However, it is definitely good to be engaged and to contact your representatives and senators on the issue. You
circling back to your article about the 2002 Bush steel tariffs. So As we can look back kind of with the long view, what were the impacts economically of those steel tariffs? And did they ever expire? Are they still part of all those tariffs that you mentioned earlier in the interview that are actually still out there? So what was the street level impact back in 2002, or did it take a few years to get there?
Almost immediately, the impact of the higher prices of steel were felt. So the tariffs went into effect in March of 2002, and this study looks at the impact during the year 2002. And so, like I said, in Virginia, more than 5,000 jobs were lost, and in total, nearly 200,000 jobs were lost in the United States. So the lesson is that the long-term and even immediate impact of tariffs are higher prices or smaller quantities that are available for U.S. companies and consumers, and that results in lost business, reduced employment, and slower economic growth. In December of 2003, President Bush announced his decision to repeal the tariffs, so they were only in effect for 21 months, but they had a very significant impact in that short duration of time that they were in effect.
And in all irony, Erica, it actually damaged the very manufacturing that he was looking to supposedly protect, wasn't it?
Yes. Tariffs are ineffective at their primary policy goal.
Well, Erica, thank you very much. We're going to put a link to the column. It's at taxfoundation.org, Lessons 2002 Bush Steel Tariffs. And I appreciate your visit, and thank you for a wonderful article on it. We're going to share it with all of our listeners as well, and I think it is something that should inform whether it's congressional delegations and or our Senate delegations to work on better things forward and perhaps lowering costs rather than raising costs. And we certainly appreciate your visit with us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Thanks, Joe. Enjoyed talking to your listeners.
Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Joining us now from Virginia Senate District 13, Senator Dick Black. Find him online at senatorblack.com is his website. Senator, good to hear from you. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing great, and it's very good to hear from you. I appreciate everything that you're doing.
Well, welcome back to the program. Catch us up, and I think it is April 11th. Governor Northam has set aside for the reconvening the special session. We haven't resolved the budget differences, and we're going to go back into special session. Talk about first, I guess, the other states that did it, Dick, because we've seen some profound numbers about all the things that have gone wrong in these states that have already done Medicaid expansion years ago, haven't we?
Well, yes. The problem is Medicaid is perhaps the most corrupt of all government programs. I'll give you an example. I am aware of a family. They're on Medicaid. Mm-hmm. They have two healthy young ladies, and so the grandmother took them in and said, by the way, doctor, sometimes they get a little dry eyes, or they'll get a little dust in their eye or something. Can I get some eye drops? And he said, you must not get the off-the-shelf eye drops. He said, I will give you a prescription. He gave him a prescription for eye drops, a tiny little container, $200. And he gave them 98 refills. So you do the math on that, 100 times 200. I think you're up to $20,000.
Oh,
this is for some eye drops for some kids whose eyes are as normal as yours or mine, probably a lot more normal than yours or mine.
Oh my gosh!
So it's crooked. Down in Miami, where I grew up, they have a cottage industry where you can actually purchase on the black market lists of people who are Medicaid eligible, and they'll set up these storefronts, and they'll just make out fake prescriptions and break in federal money. And the way that it works is when the feds start to become suspicious, they're required to send a 30-day notice out and notify you that you've got, you've got irregularities. You've got huge amounts of cash that are suddenly flowing in. Well, as soon as they get that notice, they close down the storefront. They wipe all the fingerprints off.
Oh my!
And they disappear. It's been going on for decades.
This is sounding like a script for Ocean's 14 or something like that, Dick. How does it that intelligent, well-educated members of the Virginia General Assembly seem to think like now is the time for Virginia, even as we watch states like Oregon. If I read the stories correctly, Oregon, like many states, said, "Oh well, Medicaid is such an efficient system, more efficient than all these insurance companies, and they do more with less, and blah blah blah." Until you start to scale up the number of people, it far exceeded what they thought. It's bankrupted them in Oregon. What has drafted these folks into the idea of now is the time for Virginia to do it?
Well, here's the thing: nothing makes a politician's money or mouth water like money, and under Obamacare, they promised that. The initial promise was that they give 100%. If you would expand welfare massively in your state, and this is what Medicaid is, it's welfare, and you would expand it into the middle class so that you put middle class people on Medicaid and put them into the welfare system, then we'll give you 100% match. In other words, or 100% rather, of the cost to expand it. Well, in Virginia, that's 400,000 people. So you're talking about a major part of the population. We've already got a lot of people on Medicaid under prior programs, but this is the first time it would move it into the middle class.
Right.
And so the problem is that you do that, and then now they've dropped the federal match down to 90%. Well, so the state's got to cough up the 10%, and so they say, well, this is still a great deal because we get we just cough up the 10% and we get the 90%. Well, the Office of Management and Budget just sent out a memo to the state of Virginia, and they said, don't count on a federal match, because we're seriously looking at terminating it, and you're going to be on your own. Well, if we expand it, I mean, you imagine, you're talking about 400,000 people getting free medical care. Now, these are people, some of them are young people who are on their way. Maybe they just graduated from Harvard, and they've gone to work for a law firm or something, but they still, they're still not to the point where this year they're going to have, a high enough income. So, so a lot of these people are moving up. I mean, that's an extreme case, but more typical is the case where you get an ordinary person, maybe somebody who starts at McDonald's and then becomes a McDonald's manager, and then, takes another job somewhere else as a manager. We all start off. I started off making $72 a month as a Marine private. And,
I understand that side of it. But so with the federal government leaving it, if I'm not mistaken, Dick, isn't Medicaid already 30% of the Virginia budget as it is?
Yes, and it is growing. It is the fastest growing part of the state government because medical care just goes up, with virtually without any constraint. I mean, it's just running wild. The cost of prescriptions is
that alone
is really extraordinary. So what we're doing is we've got a lot of politicians, and I know there are 19 of them in the House of Delegates, and there's one Republican. Now I'm just talking about the Republicans because the Democrats they put everybody on welfare from that's what they did in the Soviet Union. That's what
they're just going to keep going. Absolutely.
But anyway, the problem that we've got, probably our biggest challenge, is the 19 Republicans who were willing to break ranks and to go for Medicaid expansion. And the problem is if the federal government follows through and starts eliminating federal subsidies for Medicaid, then you're going to have a massive tax increase.
You have to
pay the bill. There's no other way you can do it.
Yeah,
I mean, everybody would be forced to pay for it because there would be absolutely no way to balance the budget. I don't care how much you cut back. We may have a little fat in our budget, but it's nothing compared to that.
And then it becomes job killing, and then it becomes more people on Medicaid because more jobs get killed. I mean, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, Dick. Senator Dick Black is on with us because once you start raising those taxes on the businesses and taking more money out of the economy, it will put more people on Medicaid, and it just becomes a bigger and bigger glut.
It's really the story of welfare. Medicaid was set up partly to finance, low income women in poverty who were having children generally out of wedlock, and that's still a major part of it. Well, anything that you subsidize, you increase, and as a result, we now have just huge numbers of out of wedlock babies being born. Fatherless, and then of course we have to pay for all the other welfare.
Mm-hmm.
So Medicaid is a principal driver in the increase in the unwed, unfathered families that we've got out there, and we're asking to move that same thing into the middle class and start taking away their incentive to work hard, to contribute to the system and that type of thing.
So here at the Virginia Institute, we put out newsletters and we've put out contacts for folks to hopefully contact these Senate conferees and the House conferees and that sanity will reign. I worry that we're going to go down that same pike we went down with Mark Warner, where eventually we get to that point where the government may shut down if we don't pass the budget. Is there a concern amongst the Senate and your fellows there in the General Assembly that this could be another scenario like Mark Warner had when he raised the taxes by bringing up this brinksmanship of, the government's going to shut down if we don't fulfill our constitutional obligation?
I don't think so. Honestly, I think the Senate caucus is prepared to just hang tough.
Okay.
And there's a lot of pressure right now on the House members, the 19 House members who broke ranks and who decided to go for Medicaid expansion. But it just, we've got a pretty honest system in Virginia, and what we're proposing to do is to introduce massive welfare corruption and basically change the culture of Virginia.
Yeah,
and so we've really got to keep the pressure on those 19 House members to see the light and to say, okay, we really should not take a reckless gamble that we might end up plunging the state into a tremendous deficit, and at the same time adding massively to the welfare rolls in the state.
Yeah, it's a double loss there. Senator Black, thank you for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Again, tertiumquids.org. Sign up for our newsletter, get those contacts, but you can always visit Senator Black online at SenatorBlack.com as well. Enjoy this first weekend of spring. Hope the snows have thawed up there.
Okay. All right. Well, God bless everyone on the air, and thank you for the opportunity to talk.
Absolutely. Senator Dick Black, for you all, from all of us here at the Virginia Institute, so long, and thanks for all the fish.